They burned every single copy in all of Germany and they thought nothing was left, and they were wrong because one copy survived and a young nun hid it under her own bed for 6 years, knowing that if they ever found it they would kill her on the spot, and what was inside that book is exactly why they wanted it erased forever. And if you love true stories of hidden courage like this, you are exactly where you belong. Welcome to The Secret Nun, so go ahead and subscribe right now and stay with me. Because this story will stay with you long after it ends. So picture this, it is May 10th. 1933 in Berlin, and the night sky is glowing orange because in the open Platz there is a mountain of books on fire and thousands of people are chanting as students in uniform throw armful after armful of books into the flames, and that fire was not random because the Nazis had made a list of books they called UN German, and they wanted every idea they feared to turn to ash, and so they burned Freud, and they burned Einstein, and they burned Thomas Mann, and they burned Helen Keller, and they burned any voice that spoke of love or freedom or equality, and they believed fire could kill an idea, and that belief is what makes what happened next so dangerous, because in a small convent just outside Munich there was a quiet library, and in that library there was a 27-year-old nun named Sister Elisabeth who was not famous, and she was not powerful, and she was not a fighter, but she loved books more than anything. Because she believed words could keep people human even when the world was trying to make them cruel. And that is why when her old friend Professor Samuel Rosen came to the convent gate one rainy evening out of breath and soaked and terrified, she immediately let him in, even though it was dangerous to do so, because Professor Rosen was Jewish and he was a gentle man who had taught literature at the university in Munich for 20 years, and he had written a small book called The Heart Still Knows, which was not a political book and it was not a weapon, and it was just a collection of stories and poems and prayers about kindness and about how every child deserves dignity and about how hatred always collapses in the end, and the Nazis had banned it the moment they saw it because kindness was dangerous to them. And so they had ordered every copy in Germany to be collected and burned, and they had done it, and they had burned them in Berlin and in Munich and in Dresden and in every city, and Professor Rosen had watched his own life's work turn to smoke, and he had managed to save just one single copy, and he had wrapped it in plain brown paper and tied it with string, and he had carried it for 3 days hidden under his coat because he knew if they caught him with it they would send him away. And so he came to Sister Elisabeth because he trusted her more than anyone, and he pressed that book into her hands, and his hands were shaking, and he said, "Please, please guard this, because if this one copy burns then the idea inside burns with it." And that moment changed her life because she took that book and she felt its weight, and she understood that she was now the keeper of the last surviving memory of something the Nazis wanted the world to forget. And so she promised him she would protect it even if it cost her everything, and he disappeared into the night and she never saw him again. And that is where her quiet war began, because she knew the Gestapo would search the convent eventually, and so she could not leave the book on a shelf and she could not hide it in the library where anyone could find it, and so she made a choice that would keep her awake for years, and she hollowed out an old hymnal that no one sang from anymore, and she slipped the small book inside it, and she placed that hymnal back on the highest shelf behind the choir books where dust already sat, and for weeks she would climb up and check that it was still there, and her heart would pound every time she touched it because she knew what she was holding. And then the first search came because a neighbor had whispered that the convent was hiding Jewish property, and 2 officers arrived without warning, and they ordered every sister into the chapel, and they began to pull books from shelves and throw them on the floor, and they were looking for anything forbidden, and Sister Elisabeth stood with her hands folded and her face calm, but her blood was roaring in her ears because the hymnal was still on that shelf, and one officer climbed the ladder and his hand moved closer and closer to that row, and he pulled out the book right next to it, and he flipped through it and he tossed it aside, and then his fingers brushed the spine of the hymnal, and he paused and he pulled it out, and Sister Elisabeth felt her whole body go cold because she thought this was the end, and he opened it and he saw old hymns, and he sneered and he threw it back on the pile, and he never realized that inside that thick cover a second book was breathing and hidden, and that close call taught her that the hiding place was not safe enough anymore. And so that night when everyone was asleep she took the book and she carried it into the chapel, and she lifted the altar cloth and she found a loose stone at the base of the altar, and she had seen the older sisters hide communion wine there during the last war, and so she wrapped the book in oiled cloth so damp would not touch it, and she slid it into that hollow under the stone, and she prayed over it and she whispered, "We will keep you alive." And for months that worked, and life went on with prayers and bread and cleaning, and the war grew louder outside, and the sisters heard the trucks and heard the trains and heard the names of their Jewish neighbors disappear, and that made Sister Elisabeth hold even tighter to her promise, because she understood now that the book was not just paper, and it was proof that someone had dared to write about love when hate was the law. And then the second search came, and this time it was worse because an officer named Hauptmann Keller arrived, and he was not careless, and he was known for finding things, and he ordered the chapel emptied, and he had his men tap every wall and lift every stone, and when they came to the altar Sister Elisabeth could not breathe, and she watched as they pulled the cloth away, and one man knelt and pressed his hand against that exact stone, and it wobbled slightly, and the officer narrowed his eyes and said, "Open it." And in that second Sister Elisabeth did something that saved the book without anyone understanding how brave. It was because she stepped forward and she said softly, "Sir, please. That stone covers a relic of Saint Teresa, and if you disturb it you will desecrate blessed ground." And she said it so calmly and so faithfully that the officer hesitated, because even cruel men feared being cursed by the church, and so he stared at her face, and he saw only a young nun with quiet eyes, and so he waved his men away and said, "Leave it." And they left, and the book stayed under that stone for another year because her faith had been its shield. And then winter came in 1941, and it was a brutal winter, and there was no coal and no food, and the convent was freezing, and the sisters burned old furniture to stay warm, and soldiers came again demanding fuel, and they took chairs and they took tables, and they looked at the chapel's wooden panels with hungry eyes. Sister Elisabeth realized with horror that if they took the altar wood for fire the book would be discovered and burned as kindling without anyone ever knowing what it was, and so she could not leave it there anymore, and so she made a third and even more desperate choice, and she took the book in the darkest hour before dawn, and she went to her own small cell, and she lifted her mattress, and she cut a thin slit in the straw, and she slid the oiled package inside, and she sewed it shut with trembling fingers, and then she slept on top of it every single night for the next 3 years, and that meant every night she lay on top of the most dangerous object in the building, and every morning she made her bed with perfect corners so no one would notice anything strange, and every inspection she stood beside that bed with her heart hammering, because the thing they were hunting was literally beneath her. And that is what courage looked like for her, not shouting, not shooting, just quietly lying on top of a secret and keeping her breathing steady while boots marched past her door. And there were nights when the air raids came and the whole convent shook and plaster fell from the ceiling, and the sisters ran to the cellar, and Sister Elisabeth would grab her pillow and run, but she would always drag her mattress with her because she could not leave the book behind to burn if a bomb hit, and the other sisters thought she was being strange and overly attached to her bedding, but they never asked and she never told. And through all those years she would sometimes in the deep night when she was sure everyone was asleep take the book out and turn its pages by candlelight and read the words that the Nazis had tried to kill, and she would read the poem about a mother singing to her child regardless of where that child was born, and she would read the story about a bread that is only sweet when it is shared, and she would read the prayer that said no uniform can make one soul worth more than another, and she would weep quietly because those simple sentences were exactly why they had burned it and exactly why it had to survive. And then finally in April of 1945 the American tanks rolled through her town, and the war was over and the gates were opened and people came out crying, and Sister Elisabeth walked to the town square and she saw survivors with numbers on their arms, and she asked about Professor Rosen, and she learned he had been taken to Dachau in 1943 and he had not returned, and that news broke her heart, and she knelt right there in the square and she held the book to her chest because she realized she was now its only guardian and its only witness. And weeks later a young woman arrived at the convent gate, and she said she was Professor Rosen's daughter Miriam, and she had survived in hiding in the mountains with a farmer's family, and she had heard her father had given his last book to a nun, and Sister Elisabeth took her hands and led her to her cell and lifted the mattress and cut the stitches and pulled out the oiled package that she had guarded for 6 years, and she unwrapped it, and the book was still perfect and still whole, and she placed it in Miriam's hands, and Miriam opened it and saw her father's handwriting on the first page where he had written for Miriam, "Remember that love is louder than fire," and she collapsed to her knees sobbing because she thought every copy was gone, and here in her hands was proof that her father's voice had not been erased. And Sister Elisabeth wept with her because she finally understood that she had not just saved paper and ink, and she had saved a daughter's connection to her father and a people's memory and an idea that hate could never kill. And later that book was copied and reprinted, and thousands of copies were made after the war, and it was placed in libraries and schools exactly where the Nazis had tried to remove it. And Sister Elisabeth never asked for thanks, and she never told many people, and she went back to her quiet prayers and her library and her simple life. But every sister who knew would later say that she had fought the Nazis not with a gun but with a mattress and with a promise. And that is why this story matters so much right now, because it reminds us that the quietest person in the room can guard the loudest truth, and that one person protecting one book can undo an entire empire's attempt to erase hope. So if this story moved you, please share it with someone who needs to hear that courage still exists, and let me know in the comments what you would have risked everything to protect if you had been in her place. I read every single comment and I would love to hear your heart on this, and thank you for being part of the Secret Nun family, where we keep these hidden stories of brave nuns alive together.